So, have you ever looked at a group of athletes and tried to compare them? Because I know that I've done that a lot. Whenever I've done that, I've tried to place them in rankings of first, second, third, essentially trying to figure out who's the best player, right? Now, consider this question again. Have you ever tried to compare athletes of different genders? Now, this is an interesting question because to many people who think about this, the answer seems pretty straightforward, and that is that male athletes are by far superior athletes when compared to female athletes. But within the last decade or so, there's been a lot of people who are saying, no, women should be able to play sports with men at the same level in the same leagues. And it started to become a very hot topic politically, and a lot of people have opinions about this, but they don't really know where the opinions came from or if it's true or not. So it's very difficult to know what is true and what's not true when it's just all this war of opinions. So that's the idea of this here video, is that I want to find validated and as true as we can get scientific information to explain these issues. And then hopefully we can have a little bit of a better understanding of what these issues actually entail and how to address them properly. Okay, first things first, let's set some ground rules. These ground rules are going to help us to understand this topic in a deeper, more meaningful way than if we were to just not have any rules at all, right? So ground rule number one is that I'm going to remain as neutral as possible when discussing this issue. I'm going to try and present only scientific facts, no opinions, just facts, as is presented in the data and as I understand it as well. And hopefully by doing that, I'm going to make sure that we are not swayed one way or another as we're discussing this issue. Ground rule number two is that hopefully you, as the viewer, are going to remain open-minded and not skeptical of ideas that you are not necessarily used to hearing or ideas that you may not even want to hear at all. And hopefully by having these two ground rules, if we are able to maintain them, that we are going to have a good, deep learning experience about this topic that is fairly controversial. So let's talk about biology. Now, we do know from several scientific studies that men tend to outperform women in muscle strength, in performance, and in speed. And a lot of that has to do with testosterone. Just the nature of the way it works in the body gives men an advantage in that way because testosterone is so prevalent in their body. We also know that men tend to outperform women by around 10%, and that performance gap has remained pretty consistent since the 1980s. On top of that, men have biomechanical advantages such as longer limbs and higher bone density, which gives them an advantage. And that performance gap is seen in several sports. In running events, men tend to be 9 to 13% faster. In swimming events, men are 6 to 12% faster. We also see some differences in soccer. In a study that reviewed several games from the UEFA Champions League, which, by the way, is one of the most prestigious soccer tournaments in the world, other than the World Cup. In these games, we saw that men cover more distance at higher speeds, especially in the most intense 5 minutes of the game. If we look at the differences between male and female skiers, we'll see that men have higher VO2 levels and their absolute strength, or 1 rep max, is significantly higher for men. So it may seem that men have a lot of advantages over women in sports, but there's also a lot of ways in which they line up pretty well. Going back to the skiing study, we see that even though men have a higher absolute strength, if you look at that strength relative to body mass, that ratio is actually very similar between men and women. And when you look at gross efficiency and perceived rate of exertion, it's pretty well the same between men and women. Looking back at the soccer study, we see that there's no difference in technical events, such as ball touches, time of possession, and duels won during either half. So simply put, when you look at the skill and ability within the game between men and women, there's really no difference at all. Now, there is an advantage that women have over men, and it's pretty well documented in scientific literature, and that is that women's muscles fatigue less, and they recover better and faster after endurance exercise, which is very interesting because you can actually see that in the literature on running and swimming events. See, if you compare first place women's competitors and first place men's competitors, you'll see that as the race distance increases, the time disparity between those places actually decreases. And that pattern holds true for first place, for second place, for third place, and even all the way down to 12th place in some cases. And overall, if you look at women's sport performance in the last 100 years, you'll see that the performance has actually increased quite dramatically within 100 years. Let's move on to psychology. No, right out the gate, I'm just going to say that there's one aspect that men have a pretty big advantage over women in, and it's also pretty well documented in ways that are not sport related, and that is spatial orientation, 3D object tracking. In a study that tested an athlete's ability to track multiple 3D objects in a 3D space, we saw that male athletes had higher speed thresholds for those tasks, and we also saw that the female athletes who participated in this study performed in a very similar way to non-athletes in these tasks. Now, this doesn't mean that women can't track a ball in any way or perform well in any sports. It just means that men have an advantage in this way and they can do it with less cognitive load. And granted, this study is pushing athletes to their breaking point, putting them in a situation that they would never see in their sports or in real life anyway. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about these results. Now, to talk about similarities, we see that once again, men and women overlap in several ways. If you look at the benefits that come from playing sports, we'll see that men and women are actually very similar. For instance, if you look at cardiorespiratory fitness, they are associated with improvements in executive function, verbal memory, and attention speed for both men and women. The only difference between men and women in this case is that cardiorespiratory fitness is also associated with improvements to cognition in men. And let's be honest, most guys could probably do for some improvements to cognition. If you look at competitiveness, you'll see that men and women are still pretty similar in a lot of ways. If we look at tennis players, we'll see that they play more aggressively on points, and they can increase their chances of winning the point from 0.5 to 0.78 or 0.80, which is equivalent to about a fourfold increase in player ranking, which, if you don't know anything about tennis, that's a lot. And these performance changes didn't differ between men and women, they were practically the same. If you look at leadership abilities, you'll see that they're also pretty well the same. If you compare WNBA and NCAA women's basketball coaches, you'll see that male coaches are not more efficient than female coaches. Once again, they're practically the same. It doesn't do anything for team morale and team ability. One aspect of psychology in sports that's very interesting is the idea of performance anxiety. Now, performance anxiety is exactly how it sounds. You get worried about how you're going to perform. And a study that looked at performance anxiety in male and female athletes compared the levels of performance anxiety and found that both male and female athletes had about the same level of performance anxiety. The only difference was that when it actually came to sport performance, only women saw a decrease in their sport performance. Now, the authors of this study had several ideas as to why this might be the case. One suggestion was that female athletes are just less confident in their abilities, and male athletes are overconfident in their abilities, and that could result in the disparity of performance between the two groups. Another theory that the authors posited was the influence of stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat means that since men are typically considered to be better athletes, women athletes become so concerned about confirming that stereotype that their performance is actually impaired. And there's another study to back this idea up. They found that stereotype threat actually has a medium effect of 0.33 on women's sport performances. And this stereotype threat was significantly higher for sports that are considered to be masculine, sports such as basketball, soccer, golf, powerlifting, etc. Now, what these studies seem to be implying is that being part of a discriminated group or being discriminated against can actually lead to poor cognitive function within sporting tasks. So now that we've looked at these scientific journals and seen the evidence that they give and thought about this question a little bit more, what does that say about athletic ability between men and women? Does it mean that men are actually superior athletes to women? Well, actually, it kind of seems like the answer is a little bit more complicated than that. Because the main thing that we found was that, yes, men do have a lot of advantages, especially with strength, with power, with speed, and some other biomechanical advantages. But in a lot of ways, men and women can compete at a very similar level in a lot of aspects. And on top of that, women do have advantages in things like endurance. So to say that men are better athletes overall is kind of looking very short-sighted on just a few things that they have advantages on, when really there's a lot that's shared between the two of them. And so for the statement that men are better than women in sports to be true, it really would have to depend on what sport we're talking about and if that sport plays to the advantages that men have over women. But even then, like, advantages are just advantages. They don't necessarily mean anything, because sports are a lot more than just strength and power and speed. They're also about tactics and skill and agility and a whole bunch of other things. So to say that men are better than women in sports that have a lot of focus on power, speed, and strength is kind of short-sighted once again, because sports are not just about power, speed, and strength. It's about the whole entire sport, if that makes sense. And on top of that, we know that women may actually perform worse in general in sports because of stereotype threat, which actually can make people perform poorly on cognitive tasks. So maybe women actually could be just as good, if not better, than men in a lot of ways, because we just don't know their full potential, because stereotype threat is really holding them back in a lot of ways. So in order to come to a conclusion on whether or not men and women can play the same sport in the same league, it's really going to have to take a sport-by-sport consideration and also look at all the advantages and disadvantages of each group to see if it leaves one group unfairly advantaged over the other. And we need to look at prejudices that could be held, so that way those prejudices don't make a group perform worse than they possibly could just because of the prejudices. Okay, one last thing before I go. I realize that there's a chance that I may have misunderstood certain things from these articles. And so because of that, at the end of this video, and probably in the description, I'm going to put all of the sources that I used to gather my information for this. And then I'm also going to include 2 other articles that are very interesting to read and that will have additional ideas about how to handle these issues.